Intro, or are you doing the intro?
Go.
Or, oh, that was actually go. Okay, hello.
Same thing every week, Tyler.
No. Usually you say intro and then you say go. Okay, so welcome everybody. Ben and I are going to put our game faces on. Max was just saying we both looked a little sleepy. It's been a long week. We're all working really hard, and it's also we've had like that kind of weather that makes you want to hibernate. It's been gray and raining for several days. And what was it, Wednesday night we had tornado warnings and everybody bolted.
Oh yeah, everybody left immediately. And it like burst into a storm seconds later.
So everybody left. I was kind of heads down, so I kind of put my head up and suddenly everybody was gone. And Michelle and I were still here, and we went over and told the Kirkland office over on the webcam, hey, there's a storm coming, everybody's bolted for home, people should be on later. And while we were talking, in about a 3-minute span, it just got pitch black outside and all the trees started going sideways. And Michelle and I looked at each other and like, well, we're stuck here now, at least for a little while. Okay, so weather reports aside, I should not put my phone here. I'm always looking at it. It's like the other information route. So for anybody who's new, we're going to go over the top 10, which is the top 10-ish. As it's now typically way more than 10. What do we have, 14? 14, and I got to fill in Matt's, which is the highlights of the week. Things are still going along well. We're still on track for beta. We still have a few things to do. We've got some large code changes coming in from Andrew and George, so we've done a lot of testing this week to push changes. I'm basically reading number 1.
Yeah, let's just start the list, and then we can say what we did.
Okay. Number 1, testing. This week, Colin focused on improvements to the physics server crashes we were experiencing. Compared to the previous fix, this one does not significantly impact performance with large-scale battles, tested at 3,000 arcs. And in parentheses ahead, when we say large, we mean it. We tested these changes from Tuesday through Friday with IT and Alpha backers, and I believe we opened up to some betas today, which I'm not 100% sure. But we've been testing for 4 days this week. We're basically going to see how everything works out today to determine whether we'll do any additional weekend testing. So that's a little bit up in the air right now. In fact, I probably should try and get Tim's attention. But we'll let you guys know later in the update as well. Number 2.
Chad is saying that the test wasn't open to betas.
Yeah, I think it was determined based on performance and testing what was going on. Basically, we typically to get to betas, like I said last week, we very much know that you guys haven't seen a lot of the new stuff that we've been working on, and when we get to that point, we try to make sure that we've gotten the big egregious bugs out of the way, and those are typically things that make it unplayable. So this physics server crash was certainly doing that, but we're testing 2 changes from Colin. Last weekend's was basically a band-aid. The beginning of this week, he put in, like I said, a much better tweak. Audio objects. So audio is one of those things that we knew we were going to have to get to before beta 1, mainly around performance. So last week Dave did a WISE update, which made it so that DB's profiler was no longer crashing. And to actually profile performance of sounds, you need your profiler. So that fixed that. This week he went into sound objects. This work removes the leak of audio assets in the scene and gives us more control over defining the proper events for stopping looping sounds. Now, during big battles, you should not experience extra sounds that should not have been there. Basically, we had a bunch of sounds that were just hanging out way longer than they should, or I think if you were changing zones, we dragged some of the sounds with us and back, so this is just a really good fix. The next thing, which I don't have listed here, that he's working on is LODing for sounds as well. And he had a really cool thing over there, a little debugging tool. We had several bugs reported where some of the lights were flickering out when you looked in certain directions. And we had maxed out the number of lights, so some of the lights would go off.
Man, we have a really high number of lights. That's surprising.
So Mike and I talked about it, and for right now, he's reduced, instead of like using a large number of lights, he uses just like a setting to average them. Oh, so it's one light. So you know all those crystals that we put in look really nice?
Yep, those are all lights.
Well, they all had up to 28 lights per for each particle being played. So it gave you this really cool look kind of as they moved around the crystals. But there's a lot of them that we put in there.
So I think that kind of average per model?
Yeah, so right now he's set them to average. And basically this will be probably one of the things we look at in beta is VFX LOD. One of the things we've talked about, because we want to do really big battles, and we also want you to know what's going on. There's a big dependency on the visuals, and of course, VFX is a big part of that. And the changes we did last year for the OIT rendering for the particles gave us a big performance improvement. But one of the things we also want to do is do more aggressive LODing of things in the distance. And we've also talked about kind of like I'm going to talk about this. This isn't an immediate plan to do right away, but like if we do anything that's more expensive for particles and give Mike fancier tools, we've talked about kind of lotting like near and far, so much simpler version of things out in the distance and much cooler things up close. So before we give Mike any really fancy stuff, we're going to have to think about that as well.
Well, simpler and more obvious in some cases
too.
So whereas models tend to get like simpler and simpler and like less obvious the farther you go, visual effects kind of have an opposite problem where you want things to be fairly subtle close up because you can notice them very easily. But if they're far away, you want to see that explosion.
You need to
happening.
know that blue fire over there is a specific ability or something like that. Yeah.
So it's less cards and it's less rendering, but it's also bigger and brighter effects farther away, so you can still see them.
Yeah, personally, the challenge I find very exciting, and I'm sure is a headache for design, is doing big battles. Like just even from anything that we are doing here that touches big battles is certainly a challenge because it's on a scale that nobody's done before. Let's see, tech item permission. Do you want to read any of these, or you want me to just keep going? You don't have to.
Can do that one.
Tech item permissions and equip restrictions. So AJ committed his work this week that will allow us to do things like add restrictions to who can use certain types of gear or set permissions for containers such as a guild stash. Number 4, work in progress tech cross-server scenario. So, after working on the physics server issue, Colin found time to get back to his original task, which is allowing players to queue for scenarios from different zones. This week, he's working on finishing up the zone transition part of the task, and is beginning work on the logic to determine which server a scenario should start on. So, basically, when you can queue up and from different zones, and then it'll all warp you into that zone to play.
Because the way beta is going to work, right? You start off on your starter island, which is realm specific.
Yeah.
And then you'll queue into a scenario, and that will teleport everybody from all 3 realms into the same zone together, and then you'll play through the scenario, and then you'll get kicked back out at the end, back to where you started in your own realm-specific starter island.
So there's a bit of work there to do all this. Number 5, tech, server startup and collision. So earlier this week, Rob improved our server startup process, which I think, we can confidently say, Thursday morning was fun when everything was down, and he said, I might have done this.
Yeah, it's better now, for sure.
It's better now. He also fixed some collision issues that were causing objects' collisions to not match the visuals if they were scaled and rotated. That one was just kind of something that came out of Dion looking at bugs in the scenario editor going, I just changed this and it doesn't look right, and then Ben trying to gray box stuff. And for anybody who doesn't know, gray boxing is you take gray boxes and you block out a level or something, and every time he had rotated everything, all the collision wasn't rotating. So that seems to be fixed to a point that it's usable for us now, and we want to do some more work on it later. I think it was basically, hey, make volume, you could type in exactly what you want was the idea within the editor. Work in progress, branching content system. So Bull began work on the system earlier this week, which will allow us to have different content on different servers. This will make it easier for us to have more timely bug fixes and in some cases hot fixes. Additionally, it will allow for fine-tuned control over backing up and removing changes to the game, which should reduce the overall bug count. So, for us that's a pretty sexy item, not necessarily... Well, actually, the hot fix is great.
Do you want to explain how that works?
Yeah, you want to keep going?
Well, I can explain.
Want to add to it?
So, the important bit of that is, like for code right now, we can take a specific code change, like one specific line of code even, and move it to another server and be like, okay, this fix to this problem, we're going to take that one fix, not all of the things that have changed since the last time we copied everything, but just this one thing and change it on another server. For assets, we can't do that. So if you fix a tree or a bush or a rock or something, it's like,
that never
the
happens,
collision is
right
wrong,
the first
or
time.
the texture is messed up or whatever. We have to copy literally the entire channel from one server to another in order to get that one fix that we wanted. So this is going to enable us to just take the rock and fix just one rock from one server to another.
Are we sure?
That's what this is all about, so that we can branch and merge content the way that we can branch and merge code.
Okay. Okay, so I had 7 for Matt in here. He had a bunch of smaller fixes. Matt's been a really good firefighter the last couple of weeks, so sometimes people will end up with a whole bunch of different things on the list that they worked on, and I figured I might as well shout out for Matt helping us with a long-standing bug in the terrain editor that basically was something we'd never encountered because we'd never done as much by hand work like we did in Scenario 2. And basically, when you layer one mod and then you select a point on top of it and layer another mod and then select another point on that and layer another mod, in the editor, those subsequent additions that were being added were not visually showing up, and you had to go in and wiggle the points. So anybody working on top of, say, me, did not necessarily know what was in the map and what it should look like and where the points were and at what subdivision level. So like I had to tell Dion, here's these 5 or 6 mods that you got to go wiggle all these points to see what you're supposed to be seeing. So late last night, he and I were sitting here making a little test map, and it was one of those classic debugging things where you're like, well, why does that work and that doesn't? These should be related. And so the good thing is it was a quick fix, and thank you, Matt. Number 8, tech crafting, work in progress. Christina's been neck deep in crafting. Now the flow of generating a Vox from a Vox token should be working end to end with the help of AJ and Matt. Players can right-click on their Vox token in the UI, choose deploy, choose the spot they want to place their Vox in the world, and pack it back into their Vox when done. Christina's also been creating mock-ups for the crafting process, which will be the next step for the upcoming crafting UI. Yay! Work in progress, art, environment art. Dion is currently working through several new variations of spruce pines. I actually forgot to say on here she did a whole bunch of little tweaks in the map that I just didn't have time for as I moved on to other things. Tyler, that's myself, began working on more variation for the beaches. Andrew provided some great reference from his trip to Ireland, including many pictures of a really great bog he visited. So the bog isn't necessarily a beach asset, and we will need more capability when it comes to like placing water planes and having a water shader and things like that. So the first thing I'm really going for is just I shoehorned in like a tan sand on the beach and never had time to do anything else. So while Ben is working on the home island template before I move to that, I'm gonna just try and get some time in on some whole bunch of grasses, and we're gonna have pictures in the update where I made a few materials that with the actual reference next to them. And you can see like it's just this beautiful myriad of grasses and colors. So if you look at it from the side, it's kind of greens and browns and reds. And when you look straight down, the interesting part was the ground is just this, peat and water and reds and whites and yellows. It's all these colors in there amongst the green. So kind of a fun thing to work on. And then also he had a bunch of pictures of like coasts. And not like coastline, like literally just, the beach you would walk on. So it's like little rocks and gray pebbles and berms of dirt falling from the grass. So a lot of fun stuff that I'm hoping to get in. And this actually pertains to one of the questions I usually get, are you guys going to get new biomes in for Beta 1? And as I've said, it's just, whatever time we have. So we're trying to make sure that we get the islands built for testing, and then it'll just be whatever time I've got left, we'll be making new stuff or cleaning up old stuff or variations of things. And in this case, since one of the items for Scenario 2 concepting, we're taking a break from Scenario 2, and I'll get to that. So Deanna and I are working on some other things. Actually, I might as well go to the concept art. Yeah. Work in progress art, Scenario 2 concept art. So Michelle and myself are brainstorming changes we want to make to the Scenario 2 environment. This phase was planned ahead of time, knowing we want to take a step back from the first pass and look for ways to make it better. So we'll include the concept art in today's update. It's a bit greener. A lot of what I did was kind of what I would do myself. I asked her to kind of pick some key angles where players start, where they're kind of looking down troughs, and just kind of work on silhouettes of things like, oh, this would look better if this rock kind of curved out here. It would be better if there was a mountain here. It'd be better if there were trees over here. Just kind of like an artist would, plan out the scene to kind of look for areas to improve it. On top of that, there's just a general change to the whole thing where we're going to bring in a lot more grass and green closer into the center. And then I think we're going to change, we're going to try, I don't know if this is all going to stick, we're going to try it all out, changing the tan to gray, just on that inner circle.
Yeah,
so
I think that'll blend in with the dark
that's
rocks better.
When I made, so one of the things I did when I made this whole map, knowing the amount of time I had to spend on it and how I'm constantly broken up doing other things, the whole thing was planned with lots of each corner has its own mods, even though they're doubled and or tripled, the same mod copied. Basically, because then if we ever said, hey, let's change all this to something else, I could just kind of go in and do it really quickly. So if more likely than not, the beta, when we get to a beta test on this scenario, they'll see the Wasteland version, and then it'll actually kind of get more greenified probably in the next iteration that they see. Let's see. Work in progress art, updated character creation renders. Joe moved through the female armor variations for our renders quickly and is on track to wrap those up mid next week. He'll be handing those off to John and Michelle. John is doing the rendering side, having finished the Arthurian male physician and the body of the stone healer. Next he needs to render out the rocks that will fill out the scene for the stone healer. These are all used in the character creation process. If you look at last week's posted news, Michelle gave me like a trifecta of 3 characters from the renders that she painted over, and then those match into the patcher updates that we did a few months ago. Art. SFX this week DB created a track for our pub buildings and is moving on to some realm-specific ambient tracks. Getting those in will be dependent upon Dave's time to see if he has enough time to set it so that we can play very specific ambient tracks per zone. Design. Home Islands. Ben began work on a new template for the Home Islands. The initial blockout, once approved, will then get an art pass on the environment and testing on creating the buildings. Buildings, I haven't put an item in here mainly because Andrew's just trying to last mile the building update, and we fully expect that to trounce Hatchery next week, and then we'll just start testing it and start building.
So Mark signed off on that, and I sent it over to you. I've got plots set up on there, so whenever building's ready, we'll see if we can build on it and see how big we can get.
Cool. Work in progress. Art. Mjolnir animations. So Scott moved quickly through much of the Mjolnir's animation this week. He completed updated class idle, right and left crushing attacks and deflects, as well as flinch and cast. If you missed any of this, you can check his live stream. Ugh. I'm just marble mouthing everything. If you missed it, you can catch his live stream where he finishes up the new special ability, Crushing Annihilation. Next week, he'll wrap up all the movement animations and then get back to working on the empath. That is it for the top 10-ish of 14 items. This is typically the point we go into a bit of Q&A. Keep in mind who you have here. I'm production and art, and Ben is design. So typically this is the part where I get one tree question, and you get a whole shitload of design questions, right?
Well, maybe some programming questions, and then we can make up answers.
We'll make up answers, yeah. Just like how the programmers work.
All right, it's time for the Q&A. Send in your questions. And we're going to start off with Odelvik has a question from Rhaegar. We've heard a lot of talk about sound and the noises it will make during certain situations, but has any thought gone into when we might hear absence of sound, such as all ambient music stops just before an enemy melee stealther gets in a particular range, or maybe right after an explosion?
So, that's a very specific question, or a specific use case. As we haven't really gotten into stealthers yet, there hasn't been any talk about stealthers in music. However, DB, I need to get him to stream again so you guys can ask some more pertinent sound questions, has been working on some design and tracks for combat music that adjusts based on what's going on in the scene. There's a lot of work to do around this that I'm, I can only assume at this point, he's going to want a lot of hooks for different types of events so that he can basically determine when to play certain tracks. So there is the foundation for such a thing. So if, big explosions are going off and your team is all hit, then it could change the music or the pace of the music. But, we could certainly do it for other things like stealth. I think the problem with this specific example is it might be too telling if the music suddenly goes down that there's a guy right there.
Yeah, well, it depends. Like, sort of giving you a slight warning for something that's about to happen might be interesting. But we do have the tech, basically, that says, based on conditions in the game, adjust the music tracks or lack of music tracks that are being played. So we'll play around with that some. Mostly that'll be on DB to determine what works best with the music mix and the overall sounds that are going on in the game.
Yeah, I was just going to say there's some really other cool ideas we've had discussions about around queuing players into what's going on around them that are not like a UI related thing. But I don't really want to talk about those because it's so far off to work on those things yet at this point.
Sakurix asks, is Beta 1 going to have more depth added to it, with character progression / ability builder more fleshed out? And do you think Beta 1 will be overall representative of the game?
Well, those are two kind of unrelated things. The Beta 1 is not overall representative of the game. It's a small subset of what will eventually become the overall content of the game. So there's a lot of things like the depths that won't even be in Beta 1. But
plus, there's a lot of systems that we need to test and see how they work at scale.
Well, yeah, a lot of things will have to be iterated on. Obviously, combat with only the few classes that are in beta will change drastically by the time the game launches. So it will look quite different, but a lot of the core fundamentals, like just the way that abilities basically work, or the way that your character moves, or logging in through the patcher and having character creation, all of those sort of things, just having them working on a basic level and having them tested with lots and lots of players, those sort of things will more or less carry through to the game. And what was the first part of that question again, Max?
Will it have more depth added to it with character progression and ability builder?
The ability builder right now is disabled so that we can focus on getting the right visual effects and everything hooked up to the set of skills we have on the starting hotbar. But eventually we will have that turned back on. We have to do, I think, another test here pretty soon for the ability builder to make sure all of that's still working.
Well, right now, the main concern is that opening up the ability to build a lot of abilities very greatly increases the possibility of bugs. It also includes a lot of asset work as well that needs to be done. So right now our focus is just on a set of them, and then what we need to do is look at the ability builder at a later point, because there's a lot of work that we want to do to basically rebuild a lot of the functionality and UI of it.
Yeah.
And it's kind of one of those points that it's just scary to get into before before Beta 1, when we've got all these other things we're doing.
Yeah. So
as fun it is, we know it's a very fun thing. We know it's a really cool thing. So it's very high on the priority to hit early.
Yeah. So the start of Beta 1 is not necessarily indicative of what will happen a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks after the start of Beta 1. We'll keep adding things after that. So at some point in there, the ability builder will get turned back on. You'll have access to a bunch of more abilities and skill parts than you had previously, and there will be a lot of new things that your character can do. And we'll keep adding them after that, and we'll add new classes after that. So it'll keep growing from there. But right now, the important thing to focus on are the very few starter skills that each of these classes have, and making sure that those all work exactly the way that they're supposed to, so that we can have a good starting combat experience for people to log in and try out the game.
Yeah, and I can confidently say, like, from an artistic perspective with the animations, the sound, and VFX, there's enough there for us to work on right now to get an idea of how we want things to look and feel, that having more things to do isn't really going to help us at this point until we kind of nail down some of those things and get more and more feedback from people who aren't, our regular backers who've been testing some of this for years. Sorry, go ahead.
Should I move on to the next one?
Yeah, please.
Okay. Odilvik passes along a question from Tinnis. Tinnis asks, what is the status of panic and terror systems for beta? And are pure healers designed to mitigate these effects? Or is that support bards?
Mostly that is on support. Those resources, well, panic being a resource, terror being an effect of that resource, is not in the game right now, because the classes that interact with that resource aren't in the game right now. So as we get into support, and as we get into stealthers and some other classes that can interact with that as well, that's a resource that we're going to try to prototype out, get in the game, see how it works out, and we'll decide if we end up keeping it or not. That's obviously something that you haven't seen in other games, that's unique to CU. We don't really know how it's going to play out, so we'll see how it goes. I'm really interested to see if people like it or not.
For the sake of people who may not be familiar with it, or you could tell them what it is.
Okay, so if you haven't been following the game and you don't know what all of that means, panic is generally the idea of having a resource to do with how afraid of the situation your character is, right? So if you do something scary, you affect the panic rating of another character. And as your character becomes more and more panicked, they become susceptible to terror effects, which are really bad. And the idea of that is that those effects aren't things that you can alpha strike with. You can't initiate a fight with a terror effect because people won't have built up enough panic yet. And so that allows us to have some really powerful effects that won't just be used to immediately win fights from the outset. So I think that that's a relatively safe way to go about implementing those type of effects. Again, we haven't tried it yet. It's not something that the existing set of classes really have a lot of interactions with. Healers might get a few things that have to do with that a little bit. Probably more the hybrid healers like the Devouts will. But that's something for later. So for the start of Beta 1, it's mostly just, health, blood, stamina, and those are the basic resources your character will have to worry about.
Gypsy Dancer _CU asks, will the game support targeting via the UI?
So in terms of targeting, you have click to target, where you can just click on someone and that will select them as a target, either a friendly target or an enemy target. You have hotkey targeting, where you can do tab target cycling, where it will pick the nearest target or the target that's closest to the center of your screen, or the ally or enemy that is closest to your center of the screen or nearest to you, things like that. And then once we have warbands put back together and in the game, you will be able to specifically target each individual member of your warband. And yes, we do want to have the ability for you to eventually click on the unit frame in your UI to target that person. But that's another step, I think, down the road beyond having coherent integration.
Yeah, there's
so
a there's
you
a
can actually
bunch.
do interactions like that with the UI. But eventually, that's something that we want to be able to have.
Dark Society Network asks, will the King's rewards be endangered by server crashes? What precautions are taken so that you can't lose a whole day's worth of rewards for players?
So we have to do a lot of persistence work to make sure that the things that you're doing are persisted as you go, right? So if you get any kind of progression towards rewards, if you go out and build your buildings, if you go out and trade and buy and sell things, we have to make sure that all of that will stay with your character even if the server goes offline. So it's sort of the same answer to, why do I not lose my building when the server goes down? Or how come my inventory doesn't get reset when the server goes down? All of that has to be updated and saved to the database as it happens. So as you accumulate rewards in the progression system, that progression has to get recorded to your character and saved to the database in the same way that, your stats and things like that do. So those things should, up to, a very small period of time where things, might not update, second by second, those things should not roll back hardly at all, if at all, as we save things, as you progress through the game, as you perform actions, so that when a server crash happens, if that happens, or, for whatever reason you get kicked out of the game, you can come back and hopefully will lose very little, if any, progress towards anything that you do.
Doulos OG asks, what was your funnest task this week and why?
I always like these questions. My funnest task. So one, I got really excited when Andrew said, "Hey, remember I went to Ireland and I took a bunch of pictures," and that was really cool because I immediately. It's nice to be able to say I'm going to make that versus kind of coming up with it out of your head. So there was some fun bit of joy I got there. I didn't get a lot of time to work on it this week, so I would say the funnest thing was probably working on collision bugs with Rob and Ben and terrain bugs with Matt. I think I said something to Matt last night. I was like, this is always like the funnest part of game development is like trying to figure out what the hell is going on. I always like those parts. I like the problem solving. I think Ben brought up an issue with animation timings for different weapon attacks and stuff. Like, I totally want to figure that out. That's just a fun problem to figure out.
Yeah, so there was a bit of that. I think for me, I think it was fun this week to get back into doing some level design. I don't do that very often because most of what I'm involved with involves, spreadsheets and XML and things like that. So once in a while, we're actually building a new play space where I start out with a blank slate, basically, and have to design an island. And
yeah, I think you want to have kits eventually, so you can actually put some actual visual stuff in the game.
Yeah, so our toolkit for doing that is very limited right now because we haven't put really a lot of time into building a world at this stage in development. So these are sort of the first few islands that are going to be really have a lot of time and effort put into them, as opposed to the previous islands we've always had where it's been build a kind of generic space, apply a terrain mod to it that places some grass and trees around, and that's sort of what you get. Now we're going through and actually trying to carve out specific paths and have line of sight blockers and really put a lot more intense focus on what we're building. And so making sure that the tools catch up to that and are able to do that efficiently is something we're going to have to put some more time into. So right now it's kind of a lot of work to make those things happen, but it is fun to do, and I like doing level design. I've done level design on other games, and that's something that I've always had a pretty good time with. So it's fun to do that and get away from some of the other scary parts of the game, like why in the XML is it making me do this? And
putting together just opening up the terrain editor and putting together a little island is a lot of fun. And then there's a whole bunch of happy accidents that happen when you're working with the mod editor. Like, you get crazy compared to me. I get a little more focused, and then Ben will kind of be working in big swaths.
Dark Society Network asks, can one lose their favorite sword to a disarming ability? Or will such an ability simply disable my sword abilities for a short amount of time?
So for Beta 1 right now, we don't have anything that actually does disarm. I think we haven't really talked about that in quite a while.
Yeah,
you are supposed to be able to like throw your axe and then have to go pick it up. And other people aren't supposed to be able to like take it and just run off with it and then have ownership of it. So there is a concept of like, you have an item that's owned by you that is lost in the world that you have, a certain amount of time to go pick up where other people can't take it away from you. I think primarily if I was doing a disarm ability, I would probably handle it in the other way that you mentioned, which is just to
disable.
Just to have like some kind of a combat silence effectively, where it's like you can't use weapon abilities for X seconds and then you can again. But there are situations where you might have a thing on the ground that is yours that you have to actually walk back up to and pick up. But that's something we'll have to get into, I think, a little bit later on.
Odelvik asks, if you fire at a player that's visible through a gap in the wall that's been tab targeted rather than free aimed, will the arrow hit or travel towards a particular body part and interact with the wall accordingly, or will there be a random percent hit based on the percent of enemy player visible?
Okay. So projectiles in our game use physics. So there is an actual instantiated physical object. It's not just doing like a raycast or a line of sight check. It's actually creating a physical object in the world with a vector, like a velocity, right? So the arrow will start out in front of your character, moving in a direction, and it will collide with whatever it collides with. So if there's a gap that's sufficient to where the arrow won't collide with one side or the other of it, and it can actually fly through there, it will just fly through there and continue on and hit a character as if there was no wall intersecting or in between at all. If you're too close to the wall, or if you're to one side or the other, it will just hit the wall in front of you, and that will be the result of that skill. So there's not a like accuracy lost based on how much of a character you can see or anything. It's just really physics of creating projectiles and having them fly through the air and hit things if they hit them.
Yeah, and sometimes you see them hit each other.
Drooged asks, are there any plans to make gathering resources from scenarios which are better / exotic than those found on the safe island for crafting in Beta 1?
That's a good question.
Yeah, so scenarios, the interesting thing about scenarios is that they are specifically created for testing out very precise gameplay circumstances and situations. So we're going to have very different resources, very different times. A lot of crazy things will happen in scenarios that aren't meant for the regular game. You won't be able to then take those resources out of the scenario with you. They will be deleted when you leave the scenario. So you won't be able to go into a scenario, get a bunch of crazy stuff, and then take that into the open world and then have that as part of your open world gameplay. And as we move on toward launch, scenarios will more fulfill a role of sort of a starting tutorial beginner experience, new player experience for the game, and not so much a like sort of sideshow that you can go off and do open world RVR and then decide to get bored of that and queue for scenarios and then be off in an instance that isn't affecting the open world. They're more of just a method for us to have a bunch of gameplay testing while we're in beta that will eventually fulfill a very different role of sort of the starter tutorial in the beginning of the game, but not something that you end up spending time in after you've begun the game and gotten out into the open world. This game is really about open world RVR and not about instance battleground scenario sort of gameplay.
Yeah, and right now a lot of the work we're doing is creating the systems for this. So once we get a lot of this stuff in, it'll help us create scenarios faster, hopefully.
Yeah, we do need as I was saying, we do need a system for this, because even after launch, we're going to have scenarios for the purpose of, hey, I'm a new player, I joined the game for the first time, I need to be in an environment where I can learn my basic mechanics and how to play the game, and I want that to be a queued up, instanced thing where if we have day one, lots and lots and lots of players, we just copy that instance over and over again.
And it could also be for like, hey, we're adding in a new class, we want to play this specific scenario to see how this mechanic works with that class or something like that. Focus testing in that case.
Yeah, so well that gets into a sort of a deeper question of like, well, what happens if you add a new class after launch, and how do you implement a new potential biome in a different island that you've never done before? So we'll have a
test
server that's not on the live environment where we're pre-testing our patch that will eventually go live, and that might also use scenarios for some of those cases. But in any event, the actual open world part of the game is not meant to be competed with by players playing in scenarios and wanting to do instance battles. It's more of a test case and a starter experience that need this specific feature set, and then the game itself is more focused on the persistent open world.
Right. Saccharix asks, after Beta 1 hits, will you add classes within Beta 1 phase, or will that be more Beta 2, adding the next 2 to 3 classes?
Certainly, I think that will be during Beta 1.
Yeah, I mean, it's we've only talked so far. We're very purposely focused on getting into Beta 1. So we haven't done too much planning other than, hey, these are probably some of the early things we need to hit. So date-wise and phase of beta, that's going to be more something we talk about later.
Okay.
But I just don't want to say like we've said specifically yet.
Yeah, well, we've talked a little bit about that. I don't know how much you want to say about it, of like, well, this is the definition of Beta 2, because we haven't even gotten into Beta 1 yet. So.
Right, that's why I'm just kind of not defining it too far right now. I mean, it's great that you're excited for new content and stuff, but we want to make sure we nail all the current content, get that in, and then there's a bunch of work that we've identified, like the ability builder, that things that we want to hit first that, are core systems that, need more work.
Yeah, but we definitely want to be adding stuff during Beta 1. It's not, Beta 1 is this feature set, and then nothing new happens until Beta 2, right? So we do want to be expanding our classes. We want to be expanding our skills.
World.
We want to be
VFX.
Expanding the world.
Yeah,
we
and
want
some
to
of
add
that
a
stuff,
lot before we get into a whole new stage.
Yeah, and in some cases, some of that stuff that we're doing, I know on the art side, like we, a while ago, we hit what we needed to do for what we were beta originally. So everything we are doing now is, I don't want to say gravy because it's something that needed to happen, but it's happening ahead of time. So like right now, Michelle's concepts we've been showing off about realm-specific VFX, and Mike prototyping new ways to do VFX and character updates. There's a lot of work that we're doing now that we'll just be carrying into Beta 1 and more. Asset-wise, that's the good thing about art, is once we have the system laid out, we just reiterate upon it. So we're kind of a little ahead in that, and we'll do things like that as we go. The same thing with environments. Right now, Dion's making a new spruce pine. I'm very excited to start working on some new assets.
Make as many more trees as you want.
Yeah.
Odalvik says, Rhaegar would like to know, will NPC merchants have endless money and always buy anything of value at the same price as any other merchant in CU?
So economy is another one of those things where it's like much further down the line. Beta 1 doesn't have, at least the start of Beta 1, doesn't have any currency or money in that way. NPC merchants are going to have contracts where they will buy a certain amount of something, and then when that contract is up, they're not going to buy anymore. Whether or not they have infinite money, like if they actually have an inventory in which they have money and they run out of, we haven't really gotten too far into that, but I do think that it's very important for us to keep a close eye on the money supply and on inflation. So I don't think we want to get into a situation where we have an NPC that has an unbounded contract where they will buy up an unlimited amount of stuff, and you can just turn stuff into that NPC and generate an infinite amount of money. We want to make sure that that players are able to get money so that there is currency available, but we also don't want to make that too freely available such that we get into an inflationary problem where you have the money that you have becomes worthless because the inflation is happening so fast that what you were paying for a sword one day is, costs 10 times as much the next day.
The man with no screen name asks, when doing research for fleshing out the various realms, how much research do you do for things like aesthetics, architecture, weapons, and armor, so forth and so on? Is it limited to a GIS, or do/can artists do their own research, like library and museum trips?
What's a GIS?
Google Internet Search?
Oh, okay. Yeah, it's a bit of everything. I mean, there's a certain part of this game that is definitely grounded in reality. We're working off of like a European idea of what things look like. So, I was thinking about spruce trees, and I found a very common one in Europe, and I said, hey, we should make sure and get that in there. I'm looking at pictures of bogs. There's a level we go beyond that I don't know that we've totally defined yet. I think we need to explore that more once we get into making more biomes and getting more like outsourcing of assets that will help define how far we push this. Michelle and I were just kind of riffing on it the other night, that how far is too far for fantasy? What does the world look like? So it's kind of a give and take, and a lot of it also just comes down to, ooh, that's a cool idea. I mean, really, if we can all go, oh, I like this concept art, oh, I want to make that. A lot of it comes from that. So, and in some cases, the artists will go off on their own. Michelle in particular, I try to keep her in the loop, kind of as guardian of what things are going to look like if there's any question, because she's really good at just keeping track of like how all the realms kind of work together. When it comes to architecture, though, a lot of that is going to be based on the materials that you're going to be crafting with. That'll help define that, and we will probably do more work later stylistically for the types of building blocks that you'll have available to you based on realm and those resources that are predominant. Yeah, a little bit of everything.
Where do you find all this?
Oh, where do we find all this? A lot of Google Internet searching. We got a lot of books early on. One of my favorite books I think Ben gave me and I ordered too was all about castles. And granted, like I said, players are going to be building buildings, so we haven't really focused on that too much at this point. We did a lot of searching for just, styles of stuff and furniture. And by that I mean like chairs, tables, bookcases, carvings and things. What does a Viking wagon look like? Like you can find these things, they do exist. So we typically take those as an inspiration, and I think our crowd enjoy a bit of historical accuracy to a certain degree, and then after that there's an artist's interpretation of make it look cooler.
Odilvik says, Tinnis asks, what will the state of weapon/ability bar switching be during beta? E.g. Winter's Shadow melee and bow weaving.
So, that's sitting behind Coherent. There was a discussion I think you guys had a couple weeks ago, right? About ability bar switching. Were you in that?
I don't think so.
Okay. So it was basically a planning meeting. So right now we're kind of in a planned to do, but we need to get the Coherent stuff in so that JB can start working on it and start actually getting everything hooked up, and then can work on fancier things. Part of the reason we haven't done much with the UI in the past few months is simply because we wanted to get this in so we weren't doing everything twice.
On the YouTube chat, Action Pigeon asks, regarding targeting, is there intelligent cone targeting with tab targeting?
Yeah. Okay, so when you push tab, and there's a bunch of people in front of you. How do you know
Right.
which one? And so, yeah, there is some code in there that says this is how we pick that. That would be, if you want to know exactly how that works, that would be a good question for a programmer. Yeah, there is a idea of like within this cone, the person who's closest to you, who's in like closest to your center line, gets priority over somebody who's further away or who's off to the side more, but maybe closer. I'm not sure exactly how that works at present, but that logic is something that we probably will end up looking at and adjusting as time goes on, as people complain about it and are like, I pushed tab and I thought I would get this guy, but I got that guy instead. Which is a thing that has happened on other MMOs as well, of making sure that we have a good logic for that, and something that people will generally be able to intuitively grasp of like, I push tab and I get the person I think I should get in as many situations as possible.
I was going to say, what is in there right now we all know needs work. Like tab targeting right now just does some wacky stuff right now.
Yeah, there are some issues with it right now, but those are bugs, and we can fix that. But there is an intended logic for how it's supposed to work that will also get adjusted.
Yeah, and I think once we do like things with vision system, obviously that's going to affect it.
Not
like we don't want you to be able to just hit tab, right, and hit a guy that you don't know was there.
Yeah, so well that's more of like who is even eligible to be targeted, right? Or who does your
versus
client
the
even
logic
know
of
about?
picking of the guy,
right?
Okay.
And this is specifically of the people that you know of. There's several of them in front of you, and you push tab. Which one becomes your target?
Right.
And how will players think? Oh, that one should be, but then
how do they feel about how we're doing it?
Yeah.
Gen 140 asks, will the trees be destructible, or only resource nodes will be?
Well, so this is more of an engineering question, but I can kind of paraphrase conversations I've had about things like this, and I believe it comes down to quantity of things, keeping all these little entities updated, and I believe networking all of this information. So it's kind of a TBD right now. We've tossed around a lot of fun ideas, like, when you enter a bush, it does something. When you chop down a tree, it does something. When you shoot through a bush, or a tree, does it light on fire? I mean, there's a lot of this stuff that, as I understand it, comes down to the difficulty of tracking every single tree as an entity. And I believe we've kind of said, this sounds scary. So I think it's more of an engineering question.
This is an engineering question. Obviously, things that are resource nodes that you're gathering from are going to be, if not destroyable, at least removable, because they are entities in the world that your character has to be able to interact with. So there has to be a logical object there for your player to be able to do something to it. But trees right now in the game are just props, so you can't actually do anything to them. They're basically just part of the scenery.
Collision objects.
Yeah, they have collision, they have a model, but they're not interactable. They're not an entity that gets tracked separately from just being
we'll
part
probably,
of the collision mesh.
Look, we got a whole bunch of really smart engineers that we work with, so I think it's just if we do anything like that, like, can I chop down a forest and clear this area to make my home, we need to come up with a way to do it.
Yeah, we've talked about some ideas for ways to do that that involve like anti-trees. But
I remember that.
But we haven't verified whether that's something that's going to be practical or not, and it's going to require further investigation that we'll have to do as we get into later testing.
Yeah, and one of the things I've noticed is, even with myself, when you're really excited about a game, there's a lot of these like tertiary elements. How do I shoot through a hole, and how do I chop down a tree and stuff? We're not really at that phase right now. We've got a lot of the big core tech hurdles that we're trying to get in for beta 1, and part of that is like the buildings we got to get coherent in, the networking, the teleporting, the zones, the physics server. There's a whole lot of this base functionality that we're at right now, so a lot of these things we'll be looking at later.
Hamblepants asks, when targeting body parts to heal, do you have to target twice, i.e. targeting the player to heal, then targeting the body part, and then hitting the relevant ability?
No, so a lot of that is done through the ability itself. So when you have a target selected, you don't select like subparts of the target. You just have a target, and that's all there is to it. And then when you're selecting what ability to use, your ability can have effects that specify what body parts to affect. The
Headshot.
baseline, yeah. So for healing, that wouldn't probably be the best example.
Maybe for the stone healer, headshot.
Yeah, I guess. But the idea would be you want to use an ability that affects the body parts that you're meaning to affect of your target. So a lot of these skills will automatically affect, like for healing, the most damaged body part will get healed, or all the body parts will get healed. And if you wanted to specify and say, no, this specific healing ability is only for healing someone's head, you can build that into the skill builder when you're actually able to build your own skills. And say, I want to have a skill on my bar that's specifically to heal someone's head, because even if their legs are more damaged, if their head runs out of health, they die. So I want to only specifically focus on doing that. So that's something that you'll be able to do with your skill selection as opposed to with your targeting.
It's like a Monty Python Black Knight question. Still alive?
Tamanus asks, will there be custom macro support that allows specific functions, such as adding a command to an ability that automatically targets the center of screen target, much like a crosshair, which removes the need of a separate bind like tab?
So there is a aiming mode that you can toggle into, which has a targeting reticle, so you can just aim it at whatever is on your screen. But there's not like a macro assist that allows you to override the default like tab targeting behavior. I'm kind of a fan of having a direct like center screen, pick the closest thing to this pixel regardless of distance targeting method, but that's something that we'll have to see if we need, depending on how the overall behavior of the tab targeting works out.
Action Pigeon asks, how is the TDD heal system going to be balanced so it doesn't feel unattractive to lose health when healing others?
So it's very tricky how that character works. So the empath, for those of you who don't know, transfers health rather than actually just direct heals.
And you also just added a fun thing to it for the animations.
Yeah, we'll see. Yeah, we'll see about that. But as you have like a physician or something, he just throws a bottle and he doesn't lose any health for that, right? And the empath actually takes his own health and gives it to somebody else. The way he compensates for that is that he can restore his own health much more efficiently. So he's very good at self-healing. So he spends a bunch of his health as he is healing other people, but then he keeps himself up very well. So if people are attacking him, he can actually heal himself well enough that he can keep himself alive better than like a physician can. So there's a little bit of a cross balance there. Also, he has the ability, well, I shouldn't say that he does. He will eventually have the ability to create a simulacrum of himself where he can make a copy of his own body and then use that as a resource, so he doesn't have to necessarily always be spending his own health in order to do healing. But that's a piece of tech that we haven't gotten into yet that is part of his baseline resource management mechanic that he still needs.
Therid asks, I'm working on a character builder website. Will there be enough knowledge on the ability system at the beginning of Beta 1 implemented, so that I can take that info as a base for my further implementation?
Well, given that we're not doing ability building right now, I'm not sure if there will be enough information to really fill out something like that right from the start. And as we get more into the skill builder with other classes, like there will be different templates for the way that skills are assembled for like support skills versus shouts or whatever. The networks will be different, so I don't think you'll be able to at least comprehensively put something together like that will encompass the way the game will work in its entirety. But once we get skill building turned on, you can certainly build something that looks a lot like that and allows players to like virtually build all their skills on a website and see what their results would be based on pulling the data from the game through the API. I think that's something that would be reasonably possible.
That sounds like something JB would be on board
exactly.
with.
You'd have to ask
JB
for the details on exactly how to do that. But we do have a mod squad that goes through and does a bunch of UI mods for the game and stuff like that. So there's ways that you could get into doing that if you were interested.
Yeah, if you're not aware of that, poke JB.
Odelvik asks, given how much... 5-minute warning, folks. 5-minute warning. I'm going to start looking for a nice question to end the stream with. Odelvik asks, given how much of a perfectionist Tyler and the art team can be, and given the number of islands needed for launch, are you at all worried about timescales?
You mean the time we have left for right now? I'm assuming. I mean, absolutely.
The time to get ready for all of the islands for launch.
So, like I've said, for right now, what we're doing is we're duping some of the islands, we're sharing some of the islands, and it's a matter of how much we can get in with the time we have. At a minimum, I need to get the islands. We need to get them basically built. We need to get teleporters on the new versions of the home island. We need to dupe out some builder islands. We need to figure out how big those are. There's still some dependencies kind of coming down the track. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, look, it kind of sucks that I've got these people who really want the game to look great and have all these cool biomes, and I do get questions about this stuff, and I totally do too. The reality of it is most of the last year I spent very focused on production and didn't have a lot of art time. So I'm now back into that with more time freed up. We hired another producer. So right now it's like I said, as much as I can get in that's new while I'm not, you know, in this case, like I had a couple of days waiting for Ben to work on the home island. So really what we want to do is I want to get some new stuff in. I want to use some of the stuff we have in different ways. We have, you know, brand new ways of doing things. The Mega Scans is fantastic for creating terrain materials really fast. So right now it's going to be a mix for anybody who's been testing the game. There's not going to be a whole lot of new things in there. At the start of Beta 1, you guys will have seen the majority of these things. Hopefully we can kind of rearrange things in the terrain mod editor and add in a few extra materials that add more variations. You may be like, oh, I've seen these bind trees a million times, but they might be in a totally different layout and have something new and interesting going on. There's also some assets that we haven't even used very much, like there's so many flowers we made and things like that, that just getting them mixed in the mods is time that you know, we'll be using. So hopefully you guys can go in there and you're like, oh, some of it looks like old assets used in new ways, some of it looks like new assets, and some of it you'll be like, oh, I've seen this, you know, look before. But as we move into beta, that's where we'll, you know, probably take a step back, look at more. I've had questions about defining things more per realm or stylistically the entire game. We'll kind of be taking a step back on those things and coming up with some, you know, overarching visual ideas before we start making a whole bunch of shit, because otherwise then we'd have to redo everything. So yeah, of course I would love to, you know, deliver a whole bunch of stuff right now, but it doesn't make sense to go too wide right now until we have a lot of this stuff laid down exactly how we want it to be.
Darlgon asks, what do you guys think about the fact that players spend massively more time worrying and speculating on the future gameplay than you do?
How do we feel about that? If anything, I mean, it's kind of great. I'd rather, you know, people speculating about all this cool stuff first means they're excited about it, they find it interesting. Second of all, I don't know, I mean, that's really it. I mean, it just shows excitement to me. I'm not...
So, to me, I think it's kind of a difficulty that we have to contend with as we have such a open development process for such a long-term project. Because a lot of the speculation and conversations that go on for years at this point just sort of grow and build on each other and don't have a resolution that they're seeking. So when we're talking about things like, what is the body part system going to be, that's just a conversation that doesn't have a conclusion. Like, I can't give you an answer because we haven't prototyped it out enough. We haven't put it to test enough. We haven't had a lot of direct feedback of it once it has all of its surrounding necessary systems to really show how it's supposed to work. And so it's just
like conversation
talk that can't
fatigue.
Go anywhere. Yeah, and it does sort of get fatiguing after a while. And so I think it's a difficulty having so much information out there without having the practical implementation of it to really test against. So I think it's something that's challenging as far as managing a long-term open development community like this.
I think my version of that, where I see it as a positive, is based on having done this for years, where I know it's easy to come up with an idea. It's a lot harder to make that idea really work and be cool and get all the tech in there to even get to that point. So I have a built-in patience for this, but I understand exactly what you're saying there.
All right. Well, that seems like the end of the stream. It's 5
Was
o'clock.
was that our really good end question?
We can ask more questions and you can do more answers if you want.
Oh, I just kind of felt like we were like, oh yeah, we don't get to get all our stuff in really fast. It felt like a downer at the end.
Let's keep going then. Let's see. All right, here's a really nerdy question.
All right. Star Trek.
Put on your bottle bottom glasses. Dark Society Network asks, speaking of realism, medieval sources suggest that archers drew their arrows to the outside or right side of the bow to shoot in one fluent and fast motion. The modern tournament draw to the inside forces you to align the arrow, keep it fixated with the other hand, and move your hand around the bowstring. Currently, CU uses this modern alignment that makes fast, fluent firing impossible. Thoughts?
Don't we have archers that knock the arrow on both sides of the bow for different animation?
The problem is I can't very confidently say which side of the bow they're being knocked on, because we also just changed the angle for all three archers, and we also just gave forest stalkers that hip quiver, so that changed that orientation. So I can't confidently say which direction they are. I will say from my perspective, part of my job has been to make it look cool. So my first focus has been, does this look cool? Not in regards to, historical accuracy for which side that we're knocking on. Ben would probably be the best person to answer our accuracy, but I can't remember where we're at right now.
Okay. Again, I don't know which archer is doing which draw right now in the new animations that we're just redoing all of the archery animations, right? So I'm not sure who's doing what. I think that the longbow actually knocks to the outside because the bow gets turned over and then it draws that way. And then the short bow that's doing the hip quiver is knocking to the inside because it's faster to get the arrow up that way. And that's in reference to like horse archery. I think like Turkish horse archery or something does it that way. Don't necessarily quote me on that. There's a lot of difficult research goes into like how exactly did people do all of these things, and what's modern interpretation, and when did people start adopting these different things versus having it come up through techniques that were from older times. And so it's really, in terms of animations, more to just give good differentiation between the classes. So you can see one character doing one animation and another character doing another animation, and that really separating out the difference between some character that's supposed to be like the Blackguard, who's stand back and shoot long range, large bow, and someone who's like the Forest Stalker or maybe the Winter Shadow, who's doing faster, closer ranged, more agile sort of archery.
I mean, this just all makes me think about like the last year where we kind of went from, we had a lot of conversations about how much realism for the attacks versus how much of it was kind of stylistic. We also had a lot of conversations about timing and everything and posing, and as long as we can go, hey, this is a great idea and it looks cool, we'll use it. I mean, Ben out of the air just was like, oh, what if we did like a hip quiver or something like that for the Forest Stalker? I didn't even know that was a thing. So that was, in that case, that was like, oh, this would be cool. This would further differentiate the character's profile and animations. You'll be able to go, that's a Forest Stalker. So really all it comes down to is if it works, if people get excited by looking at it and it's historically accurate, bonus. If it's historically accurate and it kind of looks boring or it just doesn't feel good when you're actually doing the animations, we may not use it. I mean, it's just a balance. I mean, sometimes some of this stuff is really interesting and we look for it for inspiration. But at the end of the day, if players are playing this and they don't feel that the animations are impactful or look good, then we may need to change that. So we always have to keep that in mind.
Cool. I think that was kind of a cool note to end on. Yeah?
That was a fun question.
Yeah. All right, well, keep an eye out for our update email. What's the state of testing? Is there any tests planned for the weekend? No tests
I won't know until I go talk with Tim and Brian and see how everything's been going.
Keep a weather eye out.
Yeah, so we will, it'll be in this afternoon's update.
All right. Thank you, folks. We will see you later. Thanks, Tyler.